No hate here, only passion and drama of the game. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat, made just for you. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for the twist. The story begins with the screech of tires echoed through the dimly lit street as Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop with a sharp gaze and a shorter temper, stepped out of his patrol car. He adjusted his badge under the glow of the flickering street lamp, scanning the scene ahead. A sleek black sedan was parked haphazardly at the curb, its driver already standing beside the vehicle, calm yet assertive. The man's tailored suit and confident posture didn't align with the usual stops Daniels made in this part of town. License and registration, Daniels barked, his tone cold, almost dismissive. He didn't ask, he demanded. The man, dark-skinned and impeccably dressed, reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out a leather wallet. His every movement was measured, as though he had rehearsed this moment countless times. He handed over his documents with a calm smile that bordered on defiance. "I believe I wasn't speeding, officer," he said, his voice smooth and articulate. "Mind telling me why I was pulled over?" Daniels ignored the question, glancing at the name on the license. His eyes narrowed, and his grip on the papers tightened. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here at this hour," he muttered under his breath, loud enough to sting. The man's expression didn't falter. If anything, his composure seemed to irritate Daniels further. "That's not a valid reason, officer," the man replied, his tone firm but not confrontational. "I know my rights." Daniels took a step closer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, a silent intimidation tactic he'd used countless times before. "You don't question me," he snapped. "You just answer." For a moment, the tension hung thick in the air. The man's smile faded, replaced by a steely gaze. "Officer Daniels, isn't it?" he asked, his voice now edged with authority. "You might want to reconsider how you handle this situation." Daniels froze, caught off guard. There was something unnervingly familiar about the man's tone, as if he had dealt with situations far more complicated and dangerous than this. The radio crackled in the patrol car, a garbled voice breaking the silence. Daniels glanced over his shoulder, momentarily distracted, and when he turned back, the man was no longer simply a suspect. There was an air of control about him, an unsettling confidence that gnawed at Daniels's instincts. "Let's just say," the man continued, "you're going to remember this night far longer than I will." Daniels scowled, but unease began to creep into his expression. Who was this man, and why did he speak with such certainty, as if he already knew how this encounter would unfold? Officer Daniels clenched his jaw, unwilling to let the unease show. "Step aside," he ordered, motioning toward the sidewalk with his flashlight. The man didn't flinch, standing his ground like someone who had nothing to fear. His calm defiance chipped away at Daniels' confidence, but the officer masked it with gruff authority. "Let me explain something to you," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. "You're treading on dangerous ground. I suggest you think twice before escalating this any further." "Are you threatening me?" Daniels snapped, stepping closer, the beam of his flashlight glaring in the man's face. He half expected the man to back down, to falter. Instead, the man met his gaze, unblinking. "Not a threat," the man replied, his tone razor-sharp. "A fact." Daniels felt his pulse quicken, but he refused to let it show. He glanced over the man's papers again, searching for something, anything, to assert his authority. His eyes landed on the occupation listed under the name. Attorney. His stomach dropped slightly, but he quickly buried the reaction. "Well, Mr. Attorney, let's see if you're as good at following the law as you are at quoting it," Daniels said, holding up the papers mockingly. "Got anything in the car I should know about? Drugs? Weapons?" The man's calm demeanor remained unshaken. "You're welcome to look," he said, gesturing to the vehicle. "But I'll remind you, officer, any unwarranted search might not end well. For you." Daniel's grip on his flashlight tightened, the challenge cutting deeper than it should have. He stepped toward the car, determined to find something, anything, to justify this stop. But as he circled the vehicle, the man spoke again, his words freezing Daniel's mid-step. "Funny how life works, isn't it? the man mused, his tone almost casual. One moment you think you're in control. The next, you find out you're not as untouchable as you thought. Daniel spun around, his nerves fraying. What's that supposed to mean? The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket, a slow, deliberate motion that made Daniels instinctively rest a hand on his holster. Easy now, the man said, pulling out a sleek business card. He held it up between two fingers, the name on the card catching the faint glow of the streetlight. Daniels squinted, reading the embossed lettering. It wasn't just any law firm. It was the law firm, one known for high-profile lawsuits that had taken down men far more powerful than Daniels. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the implications. I'm not just any attorney, the man said, his voice dropping to a razor-sharp edge. And I suggest you remember that. Because after tonight, I will. Daniels felt the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, heavier than his badge. But before he could respond, a voice crackled over his radio again. This time, it wasn't garbled. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakably urgent. Daniels, you need to get back to the precinct immediately. We've got a situation, and it involves you. Daniels' blood ran cold. The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile, as if he already knew what was happening. Looks like your night just got a lot more complicated, the man said softly, his words carrying a weight that made Daniels pulse thunder in his ears. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, the stakes rising by the second. Daniels was no longer just in control of the situation. He was part of it. And somehow, the man in front of him held all the cards. Daniels tightened his grip on the radio, his mind racing. The urgency in the dispatcher's voice wasn't typical, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. Something beyond the routine traffic stop he'd intended. The lawyer, standing unervingly calm by the side of his car, didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone felt like a silent challenge, a game of chess where Daniels suddenly realized he might be a pawn. Return to the precinct immediately, the dispatcher repeated, her tone sharp and insistent. Daniels hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to regain control, to assert authority over the man in front of him, but the creeping sense of dread clawing at the edges of his composure was undeniable. The lawyer's eyes followed every subtle movement, reading Daniels like an open book. Something wrong, officer? He asked, his voice laced with a faint trace of mock concern. Daniels swallowed hard, unwilling to give an inch. Nothing that concerns you, he snapped, shoving the radio back into its holder. But even as the words left his mouth, the creeping doubt continued to spread. Doesn't seem that way, the lawyer said, leaning casually against the hood of his car. Sounds like you've got something urgent to deal with. Maybe you should go take care of it. Daniels' jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let this man, whoever he thought he was, dictate the course of the night. But as he stared at the lawyer, a flicker of realization hit him like a punch to the gut. What if this wasn't a coincidence? The stop, the call, the man's infuriating composure. It all felt too orchestrated, like he was being played in a game he didn't know the rules to. What's your deal? Daniels asked, his voice sharper than intended. You're way too comfortable for someone who's about to have their car searched. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Search away, officer. I've got nothing to hide, but I'd be careful if I were you. Not every move you make tonight will work in your favor. Daniels bristled, the implied threat stoking the embers of his frustration. You think you can intimidate me? I don't have to, the lawyer replied smoothly, standing upright now. You're doing that all by yourself. The words landed harder than Daniels wanted to admit. Before he could respond, another voice crackled over the radio, low and tense. Daniels, this is urgent. You're needed back now. It's about the complaint filed against you earlier. The air around them seemed to thicken. Daniels felt his stomach drop as he processed the words. A complaint? Filed tonight? He glanced at the lawyer, whose calm demeanor remained unshaken. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Daniels asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The lawyer's smirk widened just enough to make Daniels' pulse quicken. Funny how life works, he said cryptically. Sometimes, the roles we think we're playing aren't the ones we end up with. The tension hung heavy in the night air, each passing second thick with unspoken challenges and mounting stakes. Daniels felt the walls closing in, the lines between control and chaos blurring with every breath. Whatever was unfolding, he was no longer the one pulling the strings. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his face steady. He could feel the weight of the lawyer's gaze like a pressure against his ribs, something that sent shivers crawling down his spine. The radio crackled again, but this time, the voice was different, more urgent. Daniels, do not engage further. You need to come in now. The command hit harder than any blow he'd ever felt, and for a moment, he froze, unsure of what to do next. The words of the lawyer echoed in his head, a constant whisper that refused to go away. Not every move you make tonight will work in your favor. A chill ran through him. It was like the man knew something he didn't, a dangerous thought that only heightened the tension in the air between them. What's it gonna be, Daniels? The lawyer asked, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that Daniels couldn't ignore. You going to follow orders, or are you going to make a choice? The right choice, or the one that haunts you? Daniels clenched his fists, trying to push away the gnawing sense of dread that gripped him. The lawyer was calm, too calm. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet confidence that didn't belong in a situation like this. Daniels shifted his weight, glancing at the patrol car, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the empty street. He was being cornered, and he knew it. He couldn't stay here any longer. The radio crackled again, louder this time, as if the dispatcher could sense his hesitation. Daniels, we're pulling you in. Do not engage with the suspect. Do you hear me? The lawyer's lips curled into a faint smile, as if he were watching a game he already knew the outcome of. Daniel's hands twitched, but his resolve held. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. It was about survival. If he went back to the precinct now, what would happen to him? To his career? He looked at the lawyer again, his eyes narrowing. Who are you really? The lawyer's expression shifted, just slightly, and for the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of something beneath that polished exterior. It was brief, a shadow of uncertainty, but it was there, just enough to send a chill through him. You really don't know, do you? Daniels felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the very foundation of the night was cracking open. The stakes were rising, and he was deep in the middle of something far bigger than he could have imagined. A sudden, sharp sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Daniel's eyes darted to the end of the street, his pulse quickening. Get in the car, Daniels, the lawyer said in a low, controlled tone. You don't want to be here when they get here. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something far more dangerous. Daniels didn't move. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the footsteps grew louder, closer. A car appeared at the far end of the street, headlights cutting through the darkness. It was coming fast. And then, just as suddenly, everything shifted. The tension in the air thickened, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Whatever this was, it was spiraling out of control, and Daniels couldn't see a way out. The car skidded to a halt, its tires screeching against the asphalt. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. Just the eerie hum of the engine and the distant city sounds creeping through the thick silence. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to act, to move, to break free from whatever trap was slowly closing in on him. But his feet felt rooted to the ground. The door to the car swung open with a metallic clang, and out stepped a figure cloaked in shadow. The figure moved swiftly, the rhythmic sound of footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Daniels tried to read the silhouette, but the figure's face remained hidden, only the faint glint of a badge catching the streetlight. Daniels, the voice called out, a voice he recognized. It was his partner, McCabe. What the hell are you doing? Daniel's stomach twisted. McCabe was supposed to be back at the precinct. What was he doing here? And why did it feel like he was walking straight into a storm? McCabe, Daniels said, trying to steady his breath. You need to get out of here. This isn't what you think. McCabe didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised by the warning. His eyes scanned the street, sharp as ever, before landing on the lawyer standing just a few feet away. The lawyer, calm and poised, made no effort to acknowledge McCabe's presence. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if assessing McCabe with the same careful precision he had with Daniels. "I think," McCabe began, his voice low and controlled, "we're all about to find out what this is, aren't we?" The tension in the air was suffocating now. Daniels could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, to escape. But the chill of realization set in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. He had no idea who was really pulling the strings, but he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than a simple traffic stop or a routine investigation. The lawyer finally spoke, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You think you're in control, don't you, Daniels? You think you can make a choice here. But the truth is, you're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Daniels clenched his fists. His thoughts were racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Every word the lawyer spoke felt like another lock clicking into place, tightening the chains that held him in this spot. McCabe looked between Daniels and the lawyer, his expression hardening. "You want to explain what this is all about?" he demanded. The lawyer didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Daniels. There was something in those eyes, a darkness that sent a shiver down Daniels' spine. It was almost as if the lawyer could see straight through him, as if he knew everything Daniels had done, everything Daniels had yet to do. Daniels' breath hitched. "What is it you want from me?" The lawyer smiled. No, smirked. But it was the kind of smile that made Daniels feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no way back. "Everything," the lawyer replied, his voice dripping with quiet menace. "And it starts with you making the right choice, the right move. Or you can keep playing this game, and I'll let you find out what happens when you lose." The sound of tires screeching once again interrupted their conversation. Another car was speeding toward them, this one slower, deliberate. Its headlights flickered as it neared, casting long shadows that danced across the street. Daniel's pulse quickened. Who else was here? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that he was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went? McCabe's eyes darted to the approaching car, then back to Daniels. "Daniels, I need answers. Now. What the hell is going on?" Before Daniels could respond, the car came to a stop just a few feet away. The door opened, and two more figures stepped out, their faces hidden in the darkness. One of them, a woman with a commanding presence, stood taller than the rest, a sharp, calculating gaze sweeping across the scene. The other, a man with a scar running down his cheek, simply observed, his hands resting casually at his sides. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. These weren't ordinary civilians. They weren't just bystanders. Whoever they were here for something. Or someone. And right now, that someone was him. "Daniels," the woman called, her voice as cold and crisp as winter air. "You've been a part of this longer than you think. Now, the question is, are you going to keep running, or are you finally ready to face the truth?" The world around him seemed to close in, the air thick with anticipation. Every passing second stretched on, pulling him deeper into the web of lies, threats, and danger. He could feel the eyes of the lawyer, McCabe, and the new arrivals on him, waiting for his next move. And somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, growing louder, closer. The clock was ticking. Whatever decision he made now, there would be no turning back. The woman took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown. Daniels couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, and every instinct in him screamed to run. But where? They had him cornered. Not just physically, but mentally. His mind raced, trying to form a plan, trying to figure out how to escape. But every time he thought he had a handle on the situation, the pieces shifted again. The woman's eyes never left him. "You thought you could keep hiding behind your badge, Daniels?" Her voice was cold, calculating, but there was a fire beneath it, a fire that made Daniels feel exposed. "You've been playing in a world of shadows, but now it's time to face the light." Daniels didn't respond. He couldn't. He had no idea what she was talking about. But the lawyer standing next to her, the one who had been so quiet until now, stepped forward. His gaze pierced through Daniels with an intensity that made him feel naked. You've been on the wrong side of this for far too long, Daniels, the lawyer said, his tone flat, almost disinterested. This isn't just about a traffic stop. It never was. This is about power, control, and knowing how far you're willing to go to protect yourself. The words hit Daniels like a gut punch, leaving him reeling. He had always thought of himself as someone who could navigate the system, manipulate it if needed. But now, standing here with the weight of these strangers' eyes on him, he realized how naive he had been. They weren't here for the petty games he played. They were here for something bigger, something much darker. Behind him, McCabe shifted uneasily, the tension in the air palpable. The familiar calm in his partner's eyes had evaporated, replaced with suspicion and doubt. Daniels, McCabe said, his voice strained. I need you to explain what the hell is going on. Now. The words hung in the air, unanswered. Daniels could barely meet McCabe's gaze. His partner had always trusted him. But this was something else entirely. McCabe wasn't just questioning Daniels' actions anymore. He was questioning his loyalty. Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. A deep, unsettling silence spread between them all, broken only by the distant hum of the city around them. Every second stretched out, the air thick with the weight of decisions yet to be made. The woman stepped closer now, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. You still don't understand, do you? This is bigger than you. Bigger than me. Bigger than all of us. The man with the scar, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. The game has changed, Daniels. The question is whether you're going to keep playing, or whether you'll finally wake up to the truth. Daniels' pulse quickened. What truth? He demanded, his voice shaking despite himself. The woman laughed softly, shaking her head. You're so blind, Daniels. The truth is, you've been living in a world of lies, thinking you were the one in control. But now, you're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Her eyes bored into his, a challenge, an invitation to take the next step. Daniels felt the ground shift beneath him. The game was bigger than he could have imagined. Every move, every decision, was leading him deeper into something that could swallow him whole. His eyes darted between the lawyer, the woman, the man with the scar. They were waiting, all of them, watching him like predators circling a weakened prey. And then, in the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. It wasn't just one car now, it was multiple. Daniels turned his head, his heart racing. The sirens were getting closer, the screech of tires on the pavement signaling the arrival of more players to this twisted game. McCabe looked at Daniels one last time, the anger in his eyes replaced by something else, something darker, more resigned. This is it, Daniels, he said. Whatever happens now, you're on your own. The words stung, like a knife twisting in his gut. But there was no time to dwell on them. Whatever had been set in motion was coming for him now, and there was no escaping it. The figures before him seemed to close in, their faces sharp with intent, their movements calculated. Each one of them knew something that Daniels didn't, and they weren't about to let him off the hook without seeing it through to the end. The sirens roared as the cars screeched to a halt, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. It was time for Daniels to face whatever waited for him in the shadows. But even now, with everything on the line, he didn't know if he was ready to learn the truth, or if the truth would destroy him first. The screech of tires and the blinding headlights from the approaching cars lit up the alley like a nightmare coming to life. Daniels didn't know who was in those vehicles, but the fact that they were racing toward him, with the sirens blaring louder by the second, sent a shiver down his spine. He had no choice but to stay put. Running now would only make him more of a target. The woman's smirk grew wider as she watched Daniels panic, and the lawyer, standing stoically beside her, didn't seem the least bit fazed by the incoming chaos. The man with the scar eyed Daniels with a mixture of pity and amusement. You think you can still walk away from this? The scarred man asked, his voice low, as if savoring the moment. You've already made your choices. Now, there's no going back. McCabe, still standing by Daniels, took a step closer. His voice was barely a whisper. What the hell is going on, Daniels? You're putting everything on the line for what? What is this about? Daniels couldn't answer. His mouth felt dry. He wanted to scream, wanted to tell McCabe everything, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the situation pressed on him from all sides, and every second felt like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. He was trapped, no longer the one in control. The people in front of him knew something he didn't, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that whatever game he had been playing, he had been outmatched from the start. The cars stopped just feet away from them. The doors flew open, and a team of armed officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the alley, their hands hovering near their holsters. These weren't just any officers. They were part of something bigger. Daniels could see it in the way they moved, in the way they all had the same cold, calculating look in their eyes. They were here for a reason, and Daniels wasn't sure if that reason was going to save him or bury him. One of the officers, a tall woman with dark, intense eyes, approached the group. She didn't look at Daniels, instead focusing on the woman and the lawyer. "We're ready," she said, her voice steely. Daniels' heart pounded in his chest. Ready for what? He thought, his mind racing. Was he being set up? Was this a trap? Were the cops here to arrest him? To help him? The woman glanced at him with a wicked grin before turning back to the officer. "Get him," she said, her voice cold and commanding. Without warning, two of the officers moved toward Daniels, their hands grabbing hold of his arms before he could react. The air was thick with tension as the other officers flanked them, watching every move with the same intensity. McCabe stepped forward, his voice rising. "You can't just take him. What the hell is going on?" His eyes were filled with disbelief, but there was something else there now too, fear. Fear for Daniels, fear of what this meant. The woman turned to McCabe, her expression unreadable. "You don't get to ask questions, detective. You've already seen enough." Daniel's mind was spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not now. He tried to break free, his arms thrashing against the officers, but their grip was ironclad. The man with the scar took a step closer, his face mere inches from Daniel's as he whispered, "You think you were in control this whole time? This was never about you. It's about something much bigger." Daniels felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, panic rising with each passing second. His thoughts scattered, fragments of confusion and fear flashing through his mind. The tall officer spoke again, her voice low and authoritative. "You've been a part of this long enough. You just didn't know it." Her words sent chills through Daniels as he realized the depth of the web he had unknowingly become entangled in. Was this the setup he had feared? Had everything he had done up until now only been leading him to this moment? The woman nodded, her smile widening as the officers began to move him toward the waiting car. "This is where it ends for you," she said, the finality in her words echoing in the alley. McCabe reached out, grabbing Daniel's shoulder with a desperate grip. "I'll figure this out, Daniels. Just hold on." But Daniels wasn't sure if there was anything left to hold on to. With each step the officers took, with each inch closer he got to that car, the weight of the unknown pressed down on him more and more. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about the badge or the law. It was something darker, and he had no idea how deep this went, or what he had just walked into. The woman's voice floated through the air one last time. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Daniels. Now you're going to see the truth, whether you like it or not." The darkened street stretched before them as the black SUV sped down the narrow alley. The harsh glow of the streetlights flickered like warning signs, casting ominous shadows across the windshield. Daniels, still restrained by two officers, had lost all sense of time. His thoughts were clouded, tangled in confusion and fear. His heart raced, his breath shallow, as the reality of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. The woman in the front seat turned, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "You're finally going to understand, Daniels," she said, her voice cool and detached. "Everything you've done, everything you thought you knew, it's all connected. You're just too blind to see it." Daniels tried to speak, but the pressure of the officer's hands on his arms only tightened, preventing him from moving. He could feel their gazes piercing into him, cold and calculated, as if they were merely waiting for something, anything, to happen. The car took a sharp turn, and for a moment, Daniels thought they were heading toward an abandoned warehouse. But when the vehicle came to a stop, it wasn't the familiar sight of rusting metal doors and cracked windows that greeted them. It was a sleek, modern building, its windows gleaming in the moonlight. It looked out of place in this part of town, like something from another world. As the doors opened, the officers motioned for Daniels to step out. His legs felt numb, but he had no choice. The woman, now standing in front of him, took a step closer, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like she could see right through him. "You still don't get it, do you?" she asked, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Everything you've been doing, every case you've handled, every person you've crossed paths with, it's all been leading to this moment. You think you're innocent, that you've been wronged? But you're nothing more than a pawn in a game far bigger than you ever imagined." Daniel's breath hitched as the realization began to hit him like a ton of bricks. Asterisk a pawn? What game? Asterisk his mind raced, trying to put the pieces together, but nothing made sense. He had been a lawyer, a defender of justice, hadn't he? This couldn't be real. He couldn't be part of some larger conspiracy. The woman's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You don't even know who you've been working for, Daniels. All those cases, all those clients, they weren't what they seemed. They were carefully orchestrated moves in a game you didn't even know you were playing. And now," she paused, her smile deepening, "now, you're going to find out what it means to be part of the game." Before Daniels could react, the front door of the building swung open, revealing a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with graying hair and a sharp, commanding presence. The moment Daniels saw him, something inside him snapped. "He knows me." The recognition was instantaneous, like a bolt of lightning striking him. It was the same man from his past, the man he had crossed paths with years ago, the one who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving no trace behind. "Mr. Daniels," the man said, his voice cold and smooth. "It's been a long time." Daniel's stomach turned. Asterisk this wasn't happening. Not now. Not like this asterisk. The woman turned to the man, a subtle nod passing between them. "He's here, just as we planned." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the moment. The past few years of his life, the cases he had handled, the clients he had helped, the people he had trusted, were all starting to fall into place, but they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. The man in front of him took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've been a tool, Daniels, a means to an end. But now that you know the truth," his eyes hardened, "you're no longer useful to us." Daniel's heart dropped. No longer useful? He tried to back away, but the officer's grip tightened once again, their hands now like iron bands around his arms. His pulse thundered in his ears. "What do you want from me?" Daniels demanded, his voice rising in a mixture of anger and fear. "Why are you doing this? Who the hell are you people?" The man chuckled, the sound sending a chill down Daniel's spine. "You were never meant to know, Daniels. But you're here now, and you're about to learn what happens when you start asking the wrong questions." Before Daniels could process the words, the man snapped his fingers. In an instant, two officers stepped forward, each holding a tablet. They handed one to the woman and the other to the man. The woman's eyes flicked over the screen. "It's time," she said softly. Daniel's stomach twisted with dread. "Time for what?" The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You've been playing in the shadows long enough, Daniels. It's time to step into the light." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a file. It was thick, the edges worn as if it had been opened and closed countless times. As he handed it to Daniels, the weight of it felt like a 100-pound anchor dragging him down. This was it. The truth. The final revelation that would turn everything he knew upside down. Daniels took the file, his hands trembling. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the thick stack of papers. Then, with a deep breath, he opened it. The first page was blank. Then the next. And the next. It was all blank. His eyes widened in disbelief, his heart racing as panic crept into his chest. What is this? He turned the page again and again, each one offering nothing but empty space. The woman's cold laughter echoed through the darkened night. You really thought you were in control, didn't you? You thought you were a player in this game. Daniels dropped the file, his mind reeling. Asterisk, this wasn't just a case. This wasn't just about the law. This was something far deeper. Asterisk, he looked at the man, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. What the hell is going on? What do you want from me? The man's smile was cruel, his words carrying a chilling finality. You're not the one who gets to ask questions anymore. Now, you'll learn your place in this game. Daniel stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind still racing to make sense of the events that had unfolded. The cold night air seemed to swallow him, suffocating him in its oppressive silence. His hands trembled as he stared at the empty pages of the file that had been shoved into his hands only moments ago. Empty. All of it was empty. The woman's laughter still echoed in his ears, but it was fading now, as if even the sound of it couldn't stay in this hollow space they had created. For the first time in his life, Daniels felt utterly powerless. Everything he thought he understood about his career, his life, his role in the world, had been shattered in an instant. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Behind him, the man, his old adversary, watched him with cold, indifferent eyes. You've learned your lesson, Daniels. In this game, you're just a pawn. His voice was low, almost detached, as if he had delivered this line 1,000 times before. But I suppose it's too late for you to back out now. Daniels wanted to fight back, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. He was caught in a web, and it was too tangled to escape. The officers released him from their grasp, their hands sliding off his arms like they were nothing more than shadows. He staggered forward, his legs unsteady beneath him, but he didn't collapse. He couldn't afford to. Not yet. He had come this far. And no matter how far down this rabbit hole went, Daniels refused to let them win. Not without a fight. In the days that followed, Daniels began to piece together the scattered fragments of his life. The past few years had been a blur of motions, cases, and trials, each one seemingly unrelated. But now, everything felt connected, intertwined in a way that had been invisible to him before. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a system, a network of power that had been operating right under his nose. And somehow, he had been a part of it. He'd won cases for the wrong people, helped perpetuate a system that played on the vulnerable, all while thinking he was a force for justice. But no longer. He wouldn't let it define him. The old man and the woman were gone now, their faces fading into the backdrop of his memory. But the world around him, the world he had come to know, had changed. He no longer looked at his law practice the same way. His relationships with colleagues and clients felt different, strained. But there was no going back now. He had to rebuild from the ground up. The twist had opened his eyes. It had forced him to confront the man he had been, the decisions he had made, and the life he had unknowingly upheld. But with that awareness came the painful realization that change would never come easy. He had been complicit. Now, it was time to make amends. A week later, Daniel stood in front of a courtroom once more, but this time, it wasn't as the lawyer everyone had known. His suit was still the same, but his stance was different, stronger, firmer, less certain in the ways of the law, but more certain of his moral compass. The case he faced now wasn't about winning or losing. It was about righting a wrong, about uncovering the truth in a system that had done its best to silence it. As he addressed the court, his words were steady, though heavy with the weight of his past. I've spent my career defending the law, but it's time I defend something more important, justice. True justice. The kind that isn't blind to the truth. He paused, letting the words sink in. I won't back down this time. The world had shifted for him, but he would no longer be a pawn in the game. He had taken his first step toward redemption, and though the path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, Daniels had found a new purpose. And with that purpose, he walked out of the courthouse, not as a man trying to fit into a broken system, but as someone willing to break that system down, piece by piece, to build something better. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the street, Daniels didn't look back. He knew that the hardest battles were still ahead, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them. And so, the story continues, with lessons learned and choices made. But the journey is far from over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking fictional tales.